Rain pelted the cracked pavement like tiny bullets, blurring the city lights into trembling streaks of gold and red. Lila ran through the storm, clutching her tote bag to her chest as thunder rolled overhead. Her sneakers splashed through puddles, soaking her jeans. But she didn't stop. Her mother's medicine was in that bag, and the pharmacy would close in 5 minutes. Come on," she muttered, breath fogging in the cold air. The crosswalk light blinked red, and she darted across anyway, narrowly avoiding a horn-blaring taxi. Her heart pounded. She made it to the pharmacy door just as the clerk turned the sign to closed. "Please, I just need to pick up my mom's prescription," she gasped. The clerk sighed, recognizing her. "You again, Lila? You work too late. I'll make an exception." "Thank you, God bless you," she said, clutching the bag of medicine like treasure. By the time she started home, the rain had turned to a thin mist. Street lamps flickered. She took the shortcut under the bridge, and that's when she saw him. A man sat curled against the concrete wall, soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead. A torn coat clung to him like a second skin. His hands trembled around a cardboard sign that read, "Just need food." Lila slowed, cautious at first, but something about the way he looked, the exhaustion, the quiet shame in his eyes, stopped her from walking past. She glanced at the steaming bag in her hand. Her mother wouldn't mind sharing soup. "Hey," she said softly, stepping closer. "You'll get sick out here. There's a shelter not far from here." The man didn't lift his head. "They're full," he muttered hoarsely. "Always full." His voice was deep but tired, each word dragging. Lila hesitated, rain dripping from her hair. She looked around. The streets were empty. Something in her chest tugged painfully. "I live a few blocks away," she said finally. "I have a couch. It's dry at least." He looked up then. His eyes were striking, a shade of gray that almost gleamed in the dim light. "You shouldn't invite strangers into your home," he said quietly. "I shouldn't leave people to freeze," she replied, steady. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. Then he gave a small, almost broken laugh. "You're crazy." "Maybe," she said. "But come on." He stared at her for a moment longer before getting to his feet. He was taller than she expected, and even under the grime, there was a certain presence about him. He moved like someone who wasn't used to being weak. The walk to her apartment was silent except for the sound of dripping water and distant thunder. When they reached her small building, Lila unlocked the door and gestured him inside. "It's not much," she said, embarrassed. "But it's warm." The man stepped in, slowly glancing around the cramped but tidy space. There were handmade curtains, a second-hand sofa, a stack of nursing textbooks on the table. A small photograph on the shelf showed a younger Lila with an older woman in a hospital gown, both smiling. He noticed how little there was, and yet how much care lived in every detail. "I'll get you a towel," Lila said, disappearing into the bathroom. He stood still, water dripping from his coat onto the floor. When she returned, she handed him a faded towel and a clean shirt that looked too small for him. "Sorry, it's all I have," she said. "It's fine," he murmured, voice almost gentle now. "Thank you. What's your name?" "Lila." He nodded slowly. "Daniel." She smiled faintly. "Nice to meet you, Daniel. Sit, please. I'll heat up some soup." He didn't move for a while. He just stood there, watching her. She moved with quiet efficiency, her wet hair sticking to her neck, her hands steady as she stirred the pot on her old stove. Something about her calmness, her kindness, stirred something in him he hadn't felt in a long time. "You always help strangers?" he asked. She looked over her shoulder, smiling wryly. "Only the ones who look like they need it? I might be dangerous." "You might be lying," she countered. but I'll risk it." He shook his head in disbelief. "You're something else." Lila served him a steaming bowl and sat across from him at the small table. He hesitated for a moment, then began to eat slowly, like a man who hadn't tasted real food in days. After a while, he asked quietly, "Why are you so kind?" Lila looked at him, her expression soft but sad. "Because someone once was kind to me when I didn't deserve it. I just try to pay it back." He nodded, thoughtful. "People don't do that anymore." "Maybe people just forgot how," she said. They talked for a bit longer. About small things, safe things. Then she gave him a blanket and pointed to the couch. "You can sleep there. Bathroom's down the hall. Don't worry, I trust you." Daniel opened his mouth to reply, but she was already walking toward her room. He sat on the couch, staring at the flickering TV in the corner. The warmth seeped into his skin, and for the first time in weeks, his hands stopped shaking. He looked around again, at the photo, the books, the worn furniture, and something tightened in his chest. He whispered to himself, almost like a confession, "I didn't think anyone like you still existed." He lay down, staring at the ceiling. He wanted to tell her everything. Who he really was, why he was out here, how far he'd fallen from the world he built. But not tonight. Tonight, he just wanted to remember what kindness felt like. The first thing Lila noticed when she woke on the bed was the smell of coffee. Not the burned, acrid smell of something left too long on a hot plate, but actual good coffee. She blinked away sleep, disoriented for a moment, forgetting why the familiar walls of her apartment seemed different. Then she remembered Daniel. She pushed the blanket aside and padded barefoot toward the kitchen, following the smell like Hansel following breadcrumbs. What she found made her stop in the doorway. Daniel stood at her stove in one of her brother's old shirts, slightly too small, the fabric straining across his shoulders, and he was concentrating on a frying pan with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for diffusing bombs. His dark hair was damp and without the grime of the street. Without the layers of exhaustion and weather-worn sadness, he looked almost impossibly young. 30, maybe. 32, at most. "You cook?" Lila asked, leaning against the doorframe. Daniel jumped, the spatula nearly flying from his hand. When he turned to her, there was something almost vulnerable in his expression, like she'd caught him doing something he shouldn't. "I try not to burn things when someone's kind enough to let me stay alive," he said, and there was humor in his tone. Lila laughed, the sound surprising both of them. It was such a normal, ordinary thing to do, to wake up and find someone making breakfast. She'd had boyfriends who did this, back when she'd had time for boyfriends, back when her life hadn't been entirely consumed by work and her mother's medical crises. But those moments had never felt like this, charged with something she couldn't quite name. "Smells incredible," she said, moving fully into the kitchen. "What is it?" "Scrambled eggs. Toast. I found some cheese in your fridge that might be from the Pleistocene era, but I didn't use it." He was studying the pan with excessive concentration, she noticed. "Also, you need to go grocery shopping. Your refrigerator is basically a crime scene." "Story of my life," Lila said, settling onto one of the two battered kitchen chairs. "Can't afford much beyond the essentials. Coffee's my luxury." Something flickered across Daniel's face. A shadow, quickly concealed. He plated the eggs with surprising competence and set the plate in front of her before she could say anything else. He'd made enough for both of them and settled across from her, watching her take a bite with the intensity of someone awaiting judgment from a tribunal. "This is good," she said, and meant it. "Really good, actually. Where did you learn to cook?" "Lived in enough places," he said vaguely. "You pick things up." She was about to probe further when her eyes landed on the stack of papers on the counter, her bills. organized neatly in a way she definitely hadn't organized them. Medical statements, rent notices, the overdue utility bill, and Daniel, she realized, had been reading them. His eyes had tracked across the amounts, had seen exactly how precarious her financial situation was, had noted the gap between what she earned and what she needed. "You went through my stuff?" she asked, not angry, but surprised. "Only the counter," he said, meeting her gaze directly. There was no shame in his expression, but there was some acknowledgement of a boundary crossed. "I was looking for coffee filters. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." She should have been upset. She should have told him that her privacy mattered, that her struggles weren't his to catalog and analyze. But instead, she found herself saying, "It's okay. I don't have anything to hide. Just the usual disaster of trying to survive in a city designed for rich people." They ate in comfortable silence for a few moments before Daniel asked about her job. She told him about the cafe where she worked, about her boss, Mr. Cole, who was perpetually disappointed with life and took it out on his employees, about the regulars who came in every morning like pilgrims visiting a shrine. "You should bring me sometime," Daniel said, "before I figure out wherever it is I need to go next." "You want to come to my workplace?" "I want to see your world," he said simply. "The place where you spend most of your time." The Morning Brew Cafe was squeezed between a laundromat and a closed-down furniture store, with windows perpetually fogged by steam from the espresso machine. It was small and cramped and smelled permanently of burnt coffee and regret, but it was also a kind of sanctuary for the neighborhood, a place where lonely people came to be around other people without having to talk to them. Mr. Cole didn't look up when Lila came in, but his lip curled when he saw Daniel trailing behind her. "Your friend looking for leftovers?" he asked, his tone suggesting that leftovers would be generous. Lila felt heat rise in her chest. "He's just keeping me company during my shift. As long as he's not touching anything or bothering the customers," Cole said, already turning away. Daniel followed Lila to the employee station, and she tried to ignore the way he seemed to take in every detail of the place: the broken register tape, the water-stained ceiling tiles, the coffee machine that made a concerning grinding noise when you tried to steam milk. She wondered what he was thinking, whether he found it all as depressing as she sometimes did when she was too tired to remember why she loved this job, despite its circumstances. The shift was slow, which meant there was time for her to think about the way Cole had spoken to Daniel, the casual disrespect. She found herself watching Daniel watch the regulars, noticing how he seemed to really see them. The elderly woman who came in every morning at 9, the young man who always ordered the same espresso and sat in the corner with his laptop, the businessman who complained about everything but still came back daily. Around mid-morning, during a lull, Cole called her over and handed her a $5 bill short of what she was owed for her shift. "That's it," he said, when she opened her mouth to protest. She saw the moment Daniel registered what had happened, saw his jaw tighten, saw something flicker in his eyes that was old and practiced and dangerous. His hands clenched into fists on the counter, and for just a moment, he looked like someone completely different from the man who'd been making scrambled eggs that morning. He looked like someone accustomed to wielding power. But then, he caught himself, relaxed his hands, took a breath, and the moment passed. Behind the cafe, on their break, Lila shared a muffin she'd smuggled out and tried to distract him with conversation. "My mom's in the hospital," she found herself saying. The words came out without planning, and she immediately regretted them. She didn't talk about this. She didn't burden people with her problems. "She had a stroke about 6 months ago. They say she might recover most of her function, but the good treatment, the rehabilitation programs that actually help, insurance doesn't cover it. So we're stuck." Daniel listened without offering platitudes, without trying to fix it. That silence, that genuine listening, was worth more than any empty reassurance could be. Maybe good things circle back when you least expect them, he said finally. She smiled faintly. That's what I tell myself every night. When Lila got home that evening, exhausted in the way that only minimum wage work could make you exhausted, she found the rent envelope on the counter. Thicker than it should have been. She pulled out the bills, her hands shaking slightly. Daniel, she called out, finding him on the balcony watching the city. Where did this come from? Where did what come from? He asked, not turning around. This money. There's $200 more than there should be. He turned to her then, and the expression on his face was carefully neutral. Maybe your guardian angel got a raise. Daniel. Lila, he said gently. Sometimes people just want to help. Let them. Please. She wanted to push, to demand answers, to understand the mechanics of how a homeless man could possibly have money to give her. But there was something in his eyes that suggested this was important to him. Okay, she said quietly. Thank you. He nodded, and they stood in companionable silence, watching the city lights begin to flicker on as evening descended. That night, after she fell asleep on the couch, Daniel stepped quietly onto the balcony. He pulled out a phone, an old one, damaged, the screen cracked, and dialed a number from memory. A voice answered on the second ring, professional and surprised. Sir, where are you? Everyone's looking for you. The board is asking questions. We need... Transfer 10,000 to St. Anne's Hospital, Daniel interrupted, his voice low and urgent. Under the name of Lila Hayes's mother. Anonymous. Make it happen immediately. Sir, are you coming back? The shareholders? Not yet, Daniel said. Not until I figure out who I am without all that. He ended the call and stood looking back through the window at Lila, her chest rising and falling gently, her face finally peaceful in sleep. For the first time in years, Daniel Carson felt something he thought he'd lost. Gratitude. And something even more. Hope. The first 2 weeks with Daniel blurred together like watercolors bleeding into one another. Mornings began with coffee that tasted like contentment, with his hands gentle on hers as they walked to the cafe through crowded streets. He learned her coffee order by heart before day 3. By day 7, he knew which regulars at the coffee shop preferred silence and which ones craved conversation. By day 14, he knew the exact way her face looked when she was thinking hard about something. The small furrow between her eyebrows, the way she bit the inside of her lip. She caught herself smiling at the thought of him while restocking the shelves at work. Smiling like an idiot while her boss watched with narrowed eyes. It was embarrassing and wonderful and terrifying all at once. One evening, he fixed the leaking pipe under her sink with the kind of efficiency that suggested he'd dealt with more than casual repairs. He had the right wrench before she could even tell him what he needed, and he navigated the cramped space beneath the sink like it was something he'd practiced before. You sure you never worked in maintenance? She asked, watching him work. He glanced up at her, a grin tugging at his mouth. I've managed a few repairs in my life. She laughed, but something inside her made note of the response, the careful ambiguity of it, the way he never quite gave a straight answer about his past. She told herself it didn't matter. Everyone had secrets. Everyone had things they weren't ready to share. But the ease between them was so natural, so complete, that she couldn't help but wonder what he was hiding. And more dangerously, she couldn't help but want to know. It was a Tuesday morning when everything shifted. Daniel went out to buy bread. He was gone for 20 minutes. When he returned, his hands were shaking so badly that he dropped the bag of bread onto the kitchen counter with a soft thud. Lila looked up from her coffee. You okay? Fine, he said too quickly. Fine. But he wasn't fine. She could see it in the way his jaw clenched, the way his eyes wouldn't quite focus. He'd seen something. Or someone. or maybe just a ghost of his former life. That night, she found him on the balcony, staring into the darkness like it held answers to questions he'd stopped asking. The city lights reflected in his eyes, but there was no light inside them. "You look like you saw a ghost?" she said quietly, joining him at the railing. "Maybe I did," he replied, and the words felt heavy with meaning she couldn't quite grasp. She waited, giving him space to continue, but he didn't take it. Instead, he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and they stood in silence, watching the city breathe around them. Later, after she'd gone to bed, she woke to find him gone from the couch. She found him in the bathroom, laptop balanced on the edge of the sink, the screen quickly minimized as soon as she appeared. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. "Bad habits," he said. "Just checking on things." "Daniel," she said, and his name felt important in her mouth, weighted with questions. "You can tell me anything you know. Whatever you're dealing with." He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment she thought he was going to tell her everything. She could see it in his face, the struggle between keeping his secret and letting her in. But then he smiled sadly and said, "Not everything would make sense," and she had to let it go. 3 days later, at the cafe, a wealthy customer in an expensive suit left his wallet on a table. Without hesitation, without even thinking about it, Daniel ran after him into the street, the leather billfold extended like an offering. The customer barely glanced at it. He snatched it back and, with the kind of dismissive cruelty that only the very wealthy could muster, tossed a coin at Daniel's feet. "Keep it, beggar." Lila watched from the cafe window as something flickered across Daniel's face. Something dark and dangerous and entirely unlike the gentleman she'd been falling for. She watched as he straightened, as his entire bearing shifted into something commanding, something that made the wealthy man take an involuntary step backward. "Do you know who?" Daniel began, his voice dropping into an octave she'd never heard from him before, a voice dripping with authority and power. Then he stopped. He took a breath. And when he spoke again, his voice was soft. "Keep your coin." The wealthy man hurried away, looking unsettled, as if he'd just had a close encounter with something far more dangerous than a homeless stranger. When Daniel came back inside, Lila was waiting for him, her arms crossed. "Who are you, really?" she asked, searching his face. He smiled, but it was sad. "Just someone trying to remember how to be decent." It wasn't an answer, but it was close enough to the truth that she almost believed him. The hospital called on a Thursday afternoon. Lila's mother's condition had worsened. The doctors were recommending immediate surgery, something they'd been hoping to avoid, something that would require money Lila didn't have. Lila stood in the back room of the cafe with her phone pressed to her ear, listening to words like emergency and critical, and felt her chest tighten with a fear so primal it was almost a physical thing. She called Daniel immediately, and he was there within 20 minutes. He found her in the apartment, sitting on the edge of the bathtub, shaking so hard her teeth were rattling together. "What happened?" he demanded, kneeling in front of her. "My mom," she whispered. "They want to do surgery. I can't pay for it. I already owe so much. And I can't." He pulled her into his chest, and she cried against him, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep inside her, somewhere she usually kept locked away because there was no time for falling apart. She had a job. She had responsibilities. She had to be strong. But with him, in this moment, she could be broken. "What if you didn't have to worry about that?" he said softly into her hair. She pulled back, looking at him with tear-filled eyes. "Don't say things you can't promise." "I can promise it," he said urgently. "I can make this happen. I can—" He stopped himself, seeming to wage an internal war. She watched him struggle with words he wasn't saying, with truths he was desperately wanting to share but couldn't. Finally, he just held her tighter. "Trust me," he whispered. "Please, just trust me." And she did. Despite every instinct telling her something was wrong, despite the inconsistencies and the evasions and the gaps in his story, she trusted him. After they visited her mother the next day, her mother looking terrified but stable, they walked home through evening streets painted in gold by the setting sun. The air was cold, and Lila found herself shivering. Daniel draped his coat over her shoulders, and she disappeared into its warmth, which smelled like him. Something clean and complex and expensive, though she didn't know why expensive came to mind. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything, for being here, for caring about me. You've been more of a friend than I've had in years." They walked slowly, not in any hurry to reach the apartment. A street musician was playing a few blocks over, a slow, aching melody that seemed to capture something essential about the moment. "I would like to be more than your friend," Daniel said, his voice barely audible above the sound of the city. She looked up at him, and his face was close to hers, close enough that she could see the exact shade of gray his eyes were, close enough that she could feel his breath against her cheek. They leaned toward each other, and for a moment that felt like it might stretch into infinity, their lips nearly touched. She could taste the possibility of it, the inevitability of it. She could feel him trembling with the same need, the same desire, the same desperate hope that had been building between them since the night she found him under the bridge. Then headlights flashed across them, a car turning the corner, breaking the moment into fractured pieces. She laughed nervously and walked ahead, suddenly self-conscious, suddenly aware of all the ways this could go wrong. Behind her, she heard him whisper something into the darkness. "You deserve better than lies." But she pretended not to hear. Later that night, after she'd fallen asleep, Daniel opened his laptop in the darkness of the living room. He accessed an email account with credentials he'd hidden from his old life, passwords he'd memorized, access to systems that thought he was dead or disappeared forever. An email from his assistant sat at the top of his inbox, marked urgent. "The board wants you back. The press believes you vanished after the scandal. We need direction on the Carson account." He stared at the words, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He typed, "Tell them I'm alive." Then he deleted it. He typed it again. Deleted it again. In the darkness of Lila's living room, with her sleeping peacefully on the bed in the next room, Daniel Carson made a choice. He chose to stay invisible. He chose to remain someone other than himself. "Not until she knows me as Daniel," he whispered to the dark screen. "Not until she knows me as just Daniel, not Carson." And in making that choice, he guaranteed that everything, eventually, would break. The distance began so subtly that Lila almost missed it. It started with Daniel checking his phone more frequently, his expression growing distant when he thought she wasn't looking. It manifested in longer silences during breakfast, in the way his eyes seemed to be looking through her rather than at her. He'd stand on the balcony for hours, his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low tones about arrangements and timelines and inevitable exposure. A week passed like this, warm on the surface but brittle underneath, like ice that looked solid but might crack beneath the slightest pressure. Lila tried to lighten the mood. One morning she woke early and made pancakes shaped like hearts, arranging them on a plate with exaggerated care. When Daniel emerged from the bedroom, she presented them with a flourish meant to make him laugh. "You're supposed to smile at breakfast," she said when his expression remained serious. "I'm trying," he replied, but the words felt heavy. "You look like a man waiting for bad news," she said, studying his face. "Maybe I am," he admitted. She didn't press. She'd learned by now that Daniel had layers she couldn't quite access, depths that he wasn't ready to share. She told herself it was okay. She told herself that loving someone meant allowing them their secrets, their privacy, their mysterious pain. But she was beginning to understand that living with someone who was waiting for catastrophe was its own, special kind of torture. It happened on a Tuesday, mid-shift at the cafe. The television above the register, the one that was usually muted, playing a news channel no one watched, suddenly captured everyone's attention because the anchor's voice was speaking with the kind of dramatic gravity that pulled focus like a magnet. Billionaire tech investor Daniel Carson, missing for nearly 3 months, has been confirmed alive. Sources suggest he disappeared following corporate disputes and significant business restructuring at Carson Enterprises, the tech conglomerate valued at over $300 million. Mr. Carson has not yet made a public statement, but the photo flashed on screen. It was him. Clean-shaven, professionally lit, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Lila's monthly rent, but it was undeniably, unmistakably, him. The same gray eyes, the same cheekbones, the same face she'd memorized through quiet mornings and vulnerable nights. Daniel Carson. Not Daniel the homeless man, Daniel the billionaire. The coffee cup fell from Lila's fingers. It shattered against the tile in slow motion, coffee spreading like blood across the floor, and the sound seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence of the cafe. Customers gasped. Someone murmured, "Wait, isn't that the guy?" Mr. Cole's voice cut through the confusion with characteristic cruelty. "That guy looks like your stray." Lila's world tilted. Everything she'd understood about her reality suddenly seemed suspect. Every moment with Daniel reframed itself. Was he genuine? Was any of it real? Or had she just been the subject of some twisted social experiment? Some rich man's game played for entertainment while she'd been falling desperately in love. She ran. She didn't think. She just moved. She grabbed her coat and ran out the back door, ignoring Mr. Cole's demands that she finish her shift, ignoring the calls of customers, ignoring everything except the pounding in her chest and the way the world seemed to be spinning too fast. She made it to the apartment in record time, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The door was unlocked. Of course it was, because Daniel lived here too now, had carved out space in her life so thoroughly that she sometimes forgot this was originally just her place. He was packing when she burst through the door. A small duffel bag lay open on the bed, and he was stuffing clothes into it with the kind of grim efficiency that suggested he'd known this moment was coming. "It's true, isn't it?" The words came out like an accusation, like a weapon. "You're him." Daniel's face went very still. "I was going to tell you." "When?" she demanded, stepping toward him. "After you'd had your little experiment? See how the poor people live? Lived with the desperate girl who gave you everything?" "No." His voice cracked. "That's not what this is. I left because I couldn't stand that world anymore. I left because I was suffocating under the weight of it." She grabbed the towel he'd used on that first night, now clean, now meaningless, and threw it at him. The gesture felt pathetic and powerful simultaneously. "You lied to me every single day. Every word, every look, every moment. All of it was a lie." "Everything I said to you was real," he said desperately, reaching for her, but she stepped back. "Except your name," she spat. "Except your life. Except your money. Except every single thing that actually matters." Outside, the rain began to fall, the same rain that had been falling the night they met, as if the universe was noting the full circle, the cosmic joke of it all. "Lila, please," he said, his voice breaking. "I was tired of people wanting pieces of me. I needed to know if kindness still existed. I needed to know if anyone would see me as just a person, not a bank account, or a status symbol, or a stepping stone to something better. You were the only one who looked at me and saw a human being. So I was your proof?" she asked bitterly. Your evidence that good people still exist? A story you could tell you're bored over expensive wine? No. He stepped toward her, and his eyes were shining with tears. You're the reason I'm still standing. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever. You showed me what it means to matter as a person. She turned away from him, unable to look at his face, unable to reconcile the man she'd fallen in love with and the billionaire she'd just seen on the news. You made me believe I mattered because I was enough, and now, I don't know what's real. When he reached out to touch her, she stepped back, putting the full width of the apartment between them. The moment was interrupted by sirens, by commotion from the street below. Through the window they could see news vans pulling up, reporters emerging with cameras and microphones like wolves catching the scent of blood. Shit, Daniel breathed, looking out at the chaos. It's faster than I thought. The reporters were already moving toward their building. Lila could see the speculation in their movements, the predatory intensity. They're coming here? She asked, panic rising in her chest. Daniel moved quickly, checking locks, drawing curtains. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have... The pounding on the door came before he could finish. Reporters shouting questions, demands, requests for comment. The building's intercom buzzed urgently. Daniel stepped protectively in front of Lila, shielding her from the window. Leave her out of this, he shouted as flashbulbs exploded against the glass. She has nothing to do with any of this. But it was too late. Lila shoved past him, unable to bear being near him, and escaped through the back door, down the fire escape, into the alley, where she could still hear the chaos of the media storm, but was, at least, temporarily hidden. She crouched behind the dumpster, trembling, and asked herself how she could have been so blind, so stupid, so desperately gullible. She hid at the hospital with her mother for 3 days. The media frenzy had reached fever pitch. Her name was being circulated, her photo appearing in tabloids with headlines like "The Mystery Woman" and "Carson's Secret Companion." Her boss fired her. Her neighbors stopped answering her calls. On the 3rd day, her mother, still recovering, still struggling with her words, grabbed Lila's hand with surprising strength and said, "The man you described, the one who held you when you cried, that's who he really is. The rest is noise." You don't understand, Lila said. He lied about everything. He told you he was struggling, her mother replied, her voice slurred but earnest. He showed you who he was when it mattered. Sometimes the biggest lie people tell is about their circumstances, not their hearts. Lila wanted to believe her mother, but belief felt impossible right now. In his penthouse across the city, Daniel sat in silence. Everything was back to normal. The board had welcomed him home with champagne and carefully worded congratulations. Investors had stopped panicking. The market had stabilized. He'd won. He'd gotten his life back. His assistant stood before him, summarizing the recovery. The narrative's being controlled. We're calling it a meditation retreat. Very private. Very therapeutic. Your image is already rehabilitating with the key demographics. The Carson account showed 15% growth this quarter. The market loves this kind of personal redemption story. Daniel stared at the floor of his penthouse, marble and cold and empty. Then why does it feel like I lost everything? He whispered. His assistant didn't have an answer, because the question wasn't directed at him. The question was directed at a girl with kind eyes who had seen a desperate man under a bridge and had chosen compassion over self-preservation. And she was gone. And because of his choices, he deserved her to be. Weeks had passed since Daniel left. Lila could measure the distance in the way the cafe's fluorescent lights seemed harsher now, bouncing off surfaces that once felt warm and familiar. The espresso machine hissed. A customer complained about their cappuccino. The world spun on, indifferent to heartbreak. She moved through her shifts like a ghost, her movements precise and empty. The kindness that had always come naturally to her, the genuine interest in regulars' names, the extra shot she'd slip into someone's cup on a rough day, had calcified into something mechanical. Polite, professional, dead. Her colleague Maya cornered her by the register, voice pitched low but cruel. "So, did he dump you? Or did you realize he was too weird?" Either way, being famous for dating someone is, like, the worst possible kind of famous. Lila didn't look up. "He didn't dump me. We just weren't right for each other." "Sure you weren't," Maya smirked. "That's why he left the country." It wasn't true. Daniel hadn't left the country. But the lie lodged itself in Lila's chest anyway. Everything felt distorted now. The tabloids had moved on to other scandals, but the cafe had a longer memory. Customers recognized her. Some asked for selfies with her. Others simply stared, as if trying to see what made her special enough to catch a billionaire's eye. That afternoon, her boss called her into the back office. "Lila, I need to talk to you about the customer interactions." Her stomach dropped. "Did someone complain?" "Not exactly, but people talk. You're the girl who caught a billionaire and then got dumped, and it's not great for the cafe's vibe. Customers feel awkward. You feel awkward. Everyone feels awkward." Lila's throat tightened. "I'm sorry, I'm just trying to do my job." "I know, and you're doing it fine. But maybe take a few weeks off? Let things settle down. Let people forget." As if she could forget. As if everyone else wasn't already forgetting, moving on, treating her like yesterday's gossip column. That evening, she returned to her apartment and found her phone buzzing with notifications. 7 messages from Daniel, stretched across the past 3 days. She didn't read them. She couldn't. The sight of his name made her chest constrict with a grief so visceral it felt like drowning. She scrolled past each one and deleted them, one after another. The phone glowed with the next message arriving as she was halfway through. "Lila, I'm sorry, I just need you to know." Delete. She sat on her bed in the dark, listening to the city's ambient hum beyond her window. The same city where Daniel was right now, probably in some glass tower, probably surrounded by people who wanted things from him. And here she was, fired from her job in everything but name, deleted his messages like they were spam, and somehow felt like the villain in this story. Across the city, in a penthouse office on the 42nd floor, Daniel stared out at the skyline he'd spent his entire adult life building. Glass and steel and ambition. Everything he'd ever wanted. It all looked like a tomb. "That went well," his CFO was saying, gesturing to the spreadsheets on the mahogany table. "Third quarter projections are up. The markets are responding well to the restructuring." Daniel nodded, though he couldn't have articulated what the man had just said. His assistant, Marcia, caught his eye with a look of gentle concern before the CFO excused himself. At the door, another board member lingered. Disappearing to some island was a bold move, by the way. Really humanized the brand. "We should do a feature. Billionaire seeks solitude. That kind of thing." Daniel forced a smile. "Guess everyone loves a comeback story, right?" "Absolutely. That's the narrative. You took time, you reflected, you're back stronger." The man left, and Daniel was alone in his office. The city sprawled beneath him like a circuit board, lights blinking on and off, millions of lives happening in miniature. He'd built this. He'd earned the right to stand here and survey his empire. So why did it feel like he'd lost everything? He moved to the floor-to-ceiling window, pressing his palm against the glass. The city was cold and remote from up here. Beautiful, but untouchable. Like being trapped behind an aquarium wall and watching the world live without you. "I'd trade all of this," he whispered, "for one more breakfast with her." Marcia appeared in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She set one down on his desk and came to stand beside him, following his gaze out into the city. "You're thinking about her," Marcia said. It wasn't a question. Always. "Then tell her. Properly this time, not through a screen, not through your assistant. You." Daniel turned to her. Marcia had been with him for 6 years. She was the closest thing he had to a friend in this building, and even she felt like an employee. Even she was kept at a professional distance. "She saw who I really am," he said quietly. "What I actually am." That was enough. That was more than enough for her to understand it was a mistake. "Or maybe she saw who you could be," Marcia said. "And you got scared." He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because she was right. And admitting it meant admitting that he'd sabotaged the one real thing in his life. He'd chosen this tower, this empire, this carefully constructed version of himself over the possibility of being known and loved anyway. At the hospital, Lila sat beside her mother's bed while the older woman read a paperback novel, her color better than it had been in months. The worst had passed. Recovery was slow but steady. Her mother would be fine. A nurse bustled in, tablet under her arm. "Just wanted to let you know your account is all settled. No more outstanding balance." Lila looked up. "What? That can't be right. We had another payment due." "Already taken care of. You're good to go." "By who? The insurance?" The nurse smiled. "That's the nice part. Someone paid it out of pocket. Private donor. We're not supposed to give names, but whoever it was, they made sure your mother got the best care we could offer." Lila felt the world tilt. She'd known, somewhere deep down, but hearing it confirmed turned her certainty into liquid. Daniel? It had to be Daniel. He'd paid for everything while she was deleting his messages, while she was hiding in the cafe storeroom, while she was pretending he didn't exist. Shame and gratitude collided inside her chest, each one fighting the other for dominance. She wanted to feel angry about it, wanted to tell herself that money didn't solve anything, that he was just trying to buy his way into forgiveness, that it meant nothing. But it meant everything, and she knew it. That night, her mother turned to her with knowing eyes. "Sweetheart, whoever paid for this, you should probably thank them." "I don't know what you're talking about," Lila said, but her voice broke. "Yes, you do. And I think you know better than anyone that sometimes people show you who they are through their actions, not their words." A week later, the news broke. Daniel had committed a significant portion of his fortune to a new housing initiative, not just donations, but direct investment in sustainable community shelters across the city. The announcement came at a charity gala, all crystal chandeliers and catered elegance. Lila watched from her apartment as cameras flashed around him in a tuxedo that had probably cost more than her rent. A journalist leaned forward with a microphone. "This is quite a departure from your previous philanthropic efforts. What inspired this particular focus?" Daniel paused. Even through the screen, Lila could see the hesitation, the careful calculation before he spoke. She could see him gathering the courage to be honest. "There's a woman," he said, and Lila's breath caught. "I met someone who reminded me that worth, real worth, isn't measured by what you own or how much you earn. It's measured by how you treat people when no one's watching, by the choices you make when it would be easier not to care. She changed how I see everything. So these shelters, this initiative, it's an attempt to build the world she described to me, a world where dignity isn't conditional." Lila's mother squeezed her hand. "I think he learned something after all," her mother whispered. Lila couldn't speak. She could only watch as Daniel stood there under those cruel, beautiful lights, half publicly confessing something that felt impossibly private. "Maybe we both did," she finally whispered back. The confession didn't fix anything. It couldn't. But it cracked something open inside her, the door she'd slammed shut against him. the door that had been sealed with humiliation and fear, and the terrible belief that their time together had been a mistake. Maybe it hadn't been. Maybe it had been exactly what both of them needed to become people capable of seeing each other clearly. 2 days later, Lila found herself standing outside the new community shelter, the one that had opened in the neighborhoods where affordable housing was most desperately needed. The building was modest but dignified, warm brick, large windows, gardens where residents could grow things. It looked like something she would have designed if she'd dared to dream that big. A volunteer greeted her at the gate. "Welcome. Are you here to volunteer, or just to see the space?" "Just to see," Lila said, though her heart was thundering in her ribs. As she walked through the halls, recognizing the blueprint of Daniel's generosity in every detail, a thought struck her. "Is Mr. Chen coming today?" The volunteer nodded enthusiastically. "He should be here this afternoon, actually. He likes to visit, talk to the residents, make sure everything's working the way he intended." Lila's stomach clenched. She could stay. She could wait. She could finally see him again and what? Apologize? Explain? Confess that deleting his messages had been an act of self-protection, not rejection? The fear crashed over her like a wave. She wasn't ready. She wasn't ready to see the disappointment in his eyes if he'd moved on. She wasn't ready to hear him say it was too late. She wasn't ready to discover that his public confession had been genuine, but his private feelings had already shifted into acceptance, into moving on. So she did what she'd learned to do. She ran. But before she left, she unwound her scarf, the one Daniel had given her that first cold night, and draped it over the shoulder of a shivering child huddled near the entrance, waiting for a volunteer to notice her. The scarf was too nice for the streets. It belonged with someone who needed it. Some small piece of goodness returned to the world. She slipped out through the gate and disappeared into the afternoon crowd. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later. He was halfway through the main hallway, nodding at residents, asking their names, when a volunteer touched his arm. "Someone left something on the front bench. Thought you might want to know about it." On the wooden bench, carefully folded, was a familiar scarf. Deep blue, hand-stitched at the edges. He'd bought it for her on their second week together, because she'd shivered during a late-night walk through the city. Daniel picked it up slowly, as if it might dissolve. The fabric still held a ghost of her perfume. He closed his eyes, and his voice cracked when he spoke. She was here. Not a question, a realization, a heartbreak that tasted like hope. That evening, Lila sat on her apartment balcony, watching the city lights blink on as dusk surrendered to night. The skyline was beautiful again. She'd forgotten it could be. She'd forgotten so many things while she was busy protecting herself from hurt. She held her phone, Daniel's unread messages still sitting in her deleted folder. Recoverable, if she chose to recover them. Her thumb hovered over the option to restore them. "If I see him again," she whispered to the city, to the universe, to the version of herself that was still brave enough to want something. "I'll listen this time. I'll tell him the truth. I'll tell him that I was scared. I'll tell him that I never stopped." She couldn't finish. The words were too big, too terrifying. But she let them hang there anyway, unfinished, in the cooling air. Across the city, in a penthouse that suddenly felt less like a trophy and more like a prison, Daniel stood at his own window, holding the blue scarf against his chest like it was the most precious thing he owned. Because it was. It was proximity to her. It was proof that she'd been near, that she'd thought of him, that she'd left something behind like a message written in fabric. He pressed the scarf to his face and closed his eyes. "If I see her again," he whispered, "I'll tell her everything. No more hiding, no more calculated words. I'll tell her that she was never a distraction from my real life. She was my real life. Everything else was just distraction from her." The same slow, hopeful piano music might have been playing if anyone had been orchestrating this moment. If someone had been writing this story. The city held its breath. Both of them, in different towers, in different worlds, finally wanted the same thing. They wanted each other. And fate, or simple physics, or the inevitable gravity that exists between two people who've changed each other, was already beginning to pull them back together. Neither of them knew it yet, but morning was coming, and with it, circumstances that neither of them could escape or hide from. With it, a choice made not by fear or pride, but by the simple, terrifying necessity of being honest. The rain would come again, and this time they would both be standing in it. The bookshop cafe smelled like old paper and possibility. Lila had chosen it deliberately, a place she'd never been with Daniel, somewhere unmarked by memory or the weight of their history. She needed neutral ground. She needed to convince herself that the city was still big enough for both of them, that she could move through it without constantly colliding with ghosts. She'd been leafing through a collection of essays on social architecture when she heard it. That voice. The one she'd deleted from her phone but never from her muscle memory. 1 black coffee, no sugar. Her fingers stilled on the page. The book suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She didn't turn around immediately, didn't want to seem eager, didn't want to seem like she'd been waiting, even though some treacherous part of her had been waiting for months. She forced herself to count to 5. Then she turned. Daniel stood at the counter in a worn canvas jacket, the kind a regular person might wear. No designer label visible. His hair was longer than she remembered, darker at the roots. He looked smaller somehow, less defended by tailoring and polish. He looked real. He turned before she could look away, as if sensing her gaze. Their eyes met across the cafe's modest expanse, and the rest of the room seemed to fall away. The barista, the other customers, the sound of the espresso machine. It all became muffled, irrelevant, like watching the world through thick glass. "Hi, Lila," he said finally. His voice was careful, tentative in a way she'd never heard before. She stood slowly, gathering herself. "You found another coffee shop." "I've been looking for this one," he said, and the weight of that admission hung between them. Not the coffee shop. He'd been looking for her. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them rushed forward. The air between them was too dense with unsaid things, with months of silence and deletion and careful distance. They existed in that space like two survivors of a shipwreck, not sure if it was safe to touch each other yet. They sat at a corner table, their coffees arriving untouched. Small talk dissolved before it could even form. The weather felt too obvious. Their jobs felt too much like armor. Everything they reached for as conversation crumbled under the weight of what actually needed to be said. "You look different," Lila offered finally. "So do you," Daniel said. "Stronger." She turned the coffee cup in circles on the saucer. "You paid for my mother's surgery." "I wanted to help. Without asking. Like before." The words came out sharper than she intended. "Like I didn't have a choice about receiving your help." He winced. The pain flickered across his face like a light. "You're right. I still don't know how to make it right. I take action instead of asking. It's a pattern that goes back further than you." She looked out the window at the rain just beginning to patter against the glass. The city beyond it was gray and soft. "Maybe start by telling the truth," she said quietly, "even when it hurts." For a long moment he didn't speak. He seemed to be gathering courage like kindling. "I wasn't actually away working on a merger," he said finally. "I was hiding. There was corruption at the company. People I trusted turned out to be everything I'd convinced myself I wasn't. I found out that the charity partnerships I'd funded for years were being used as tax shelters, that I'd been complicit in a system designed to look generous while actually being extractive. Lila turned to face him fully. When I realized what was happening, I couldn't stay. I needed to disappear long enough to figure out who I was without the company, without the money, without any of it. I went to that island to remember what wanting something actually felt like, as opposed to just acquiring it. He paused, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. I never planned for anyone to find me, especially not you. But then you did, and you made me want to come back. You made me think maybe I could rebuild something real instead of just bigger. And then you lied to keep me, Lila said. Not accusingly, just stating the fact. Because I didn't think you'd stay if you knew, he admitted. I thought if you saw the whole truth, the corruption, the complicity, the ways I'd been naive or willful or both, you'd look at me the way the world did, like I was just another wealthy person playing at being good. Tears glinted at the corners of his eyes. He didn't wipe them away. Maybe I would have, Lila whispered. Or maybe I would have stayed anyway. But you didn't give me that choice. No, I didn't. The admission sat between them like a heavy thing, but it was honest. After months of deletion and silence, of protection and distance, it was finally, brutally honest. What happened to the company? She asked. I dissolved my stake, turned over the evidence, cooperated with the investigation. There's litigation. I'll probably lose most of what I've built. He looked up at her. And it feels like the first honest thing I've done in a decade. She didn't know what to say to that. So she drank her coffee instead, and it was cold now, bitter in a way that seemed appropriate. The shelter initiative is real, though, he continued. The money is real. That came from liquidating assets, from actually trying to build something that can't be corrupted or turned into a tax scheme. I wanted you to know that. The part of me that changed, the part you changed, that was genuine. Lila set down her cup carefully. You put me as co-director of the foundation. How did you? He stopped. Marcia must have sent the papers. They arrived at my apartment, with a note that said, if you want it. He leaned forward slightly. Do you? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked, why? Because no more secrets. If you still believe in what we talked about, actually helping people, building something with integrity, this is your seat at the table, as my equal, not as someone I'm trying to impress or control or keep, as an equal. She stared at the envelope he slid across the table. Inside were partnership papers, her name in careful print beside his. Co-director. Equal stake. The kind of power she'd never imagined having. You think business fixes everything? She asked. No, he said quietly. But maybe purpose can. And maybe working towards something together, with actual transparency and equal voice, is how two people rebuild trust. She didn't pick up the envelope. Not yet. Outside, the rain intensified. It drummed against the cafe windows in a steady rhythm, the kind of rain that meant business, that meant the storm had fully committed to falling. They stood without discussing it, both drawn toward the window like penitents drawn toward witness. We should go, Lila said. They stepped outside into the downpour. She hesitated under the cafe's awning while Daniel stood bareheaded, letting the rain soak through his jacket, streaming down his face. You still hate umbrellas, she said. He looked up at the sky, at the rain falling harder now. Still hoping someone kind will share theirs. She laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, and then she stepped out beside him, letting the rain soak them both. It was cold and alive, and exactly like the night they'd met, except everything was different now. They were different, scarred, wiser, less certain they could fix each other, more certain they wanted to try anyway. I'm not forgiving you tonight, she said, rain dripping from her hair onto her shoulders. I know, he said. I'll wait. however long it takes. They walked through the city like that, drenched and careful with each other, the rain falling around them like a benediction or a test they weren't sure they'd pass. His shoulder brushed hers once, twice, and neither of them pulled away. At a corner where their paths diverged, she stopped and turned to him fully, water streaming down both their faces. "If we try again," she said, "it can't be charity or pity. It can't be you trying to prove something or me trying to save someone. It has to be two people choosing each other, knowing exactly what they're choosing." "It won't be charity," he said. "It'll be two stubborn people learning how to tell the truth. Every day, even when it's inconvenient, even when it would be easier to lie." She nodded slowly. The envelope was still in her jacket pocket, but she hadn't opened it yet. That would come later, in private, when she was ready to accept what partnership actually meant. "Then maybe we start with dinner," she said. "Tomorrow. Somewhere simple. No billionaires allowed." He smiled. The first genuine smile she'd seen from him in what felt like forever. It reached his eyes. It transformed his entire face into something undefended and young. "Dinner," he agreed. "Tomorrow. I'll send you the address." They stood there for another moment, not quite touching, not quite leaving. The rain fell harder, and the city rushed around them, people hurrying past with umbrellas, cars hissing through puddles, the whole world moving and changing and insisting on momentum. Lila turned to go. He caught her wrist gently, not holding her back, just acknowledging that she was leaving. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me explain." "Don't thank me yet," she replied. "We're not fixed. We're not even close to fixed." "I know," he said. And he did. She could see it in his face, the acceptance that there were no shortcuts, no grand gestures that could undo what had happened. There was only time and honesty and the daily choice to stay and work and try. She walked away without looking back, though she wanted to. He stood in the rain watching her go, until she disappeared into the crowd and the distance, and the city's vast indifference. Neither of them knew if this would work. Neither of them was naive enough to believe that rain and honesty and shared purpose could fix what had been broken. But both of them walked through that night with something fragile but genuine, the possibility of building something real, something earned, something that might actually survive scrutiny. Reconciliation was in motion, but it was still fragile, still uncertain, still the kind of thing that could shatter if they weren't careful. Tomorrow there would be dinner. Tomorrow there would be another conversation, another test, another opportunity to prove that they could be honest with each other even when it hurt. But tonight, they walked through the rain separately, each of them carrying the weight and the lightness of what had just happened. They had looked at each other again. They had spoken truth. They had not run away. For now, it was enough. The foundation office smelled like fresh paint and possibility. Lila had arrived at 7 in the morning before Daniel, wanting to feel what it was like to move through a space that was partially hers without him present. The sunlight streamed through tall windows onto bare concrete floors. Volunteers were already setting up folding tables for the day's intake appointments. People who needed shelter. People who needed hope. People who needed both. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later with coffee from the same bookshop where they'd reunited. He handed her a cup without asking. She'd learned to take these small gestures as what they actually were. Not control, but attentiveness. There was a difference, and she was learning to feel it. "Morning," he said, and it was casual in a way that felt new, earned. "Morning," she replied, and she meant it. There was no weight to it today. Just the simple greeting of two people who'd chosen to show up. They spent the morning working side by side, reviewing applications from families seeking housing assistance. Daniel had learned to listen more than he spoke. Lila had learned to offer ideas instead of just support. The dynamic had shifted. They were partners now in a way that went beyond romance or redemption. "Feels good to be building something real, doesn't it?" Daniel said as they broke for lunch, sitting on the edge of an unpacked cardboard box. Lila smiled. A real smile, unguarded. Something that doesn't come with shareholders or board meetings trying to dictate its purpose. Something that actually helps people instead of just making money off them. They sat in companionable silence for a moment. The banter felt lighter now, gentler. The rhythm of them had returned, but it was different. There was no performance. No desperate grasping. Just two people who'd survived breaking and were cautiously learning to trust the mend. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Simple moments that, strung together, began to feel like a life. Lila teaching Daniel how to brew proper coffee. Not just the expensive kind, but the kind that came from care and attention. He kept making the same mistakes on purpose so she'd correct him, and she'd laugh at his obvious incompetence until she realized what he was doing. "Stop letting me fix you," she said, but she was smiling. "Can't help it," he replied. "You're good at it." One afternoon, a pipe in the bathroom began leaking. Daniel got on his hands and knees without hesitation, armed with a wrench that one of the volunteers had provided. He emerged soaking wet and covered in debris, victorious about fixing something tangible. "That's not a metaphor for anything," Lila said, laughing as she handed him paper towels. "I know, but I like being useful in small ways. It feels honest." They painted the office walls together on a Saturday when no one else was around. Lila was meticulous. Daniel was chaotic, leaving paint streaks on his face and her shoulder. She reached up to wipe paint from his cheek and froze at the intimacy of the gesture. His hand came up to catch hers, and they stood like that for a moment, inches apart, aware of every way they could hurt each other, choosing proximity anyway. "This," Lila said softly. "Us working together. It feels normal." "It's all I ever wanted," Daniel said, and there was no performance in his voice. "Not the money or the power. Just this. Just you. Just us making something that matters." She nodded slowly. She was beginning to believe him. More importantly, she was beginning to believe that she deserved to be believed. But the world outside their small, bright office had other plans. A photographer caught them leaving together on a Thursday evening. They'd been laughing about something. She couldn't remember what. And the photo captured them in a moment of genuine joy, arms almost touching, heads angled toward each other with the ease of people who no longer needed to pretend. By Friday morning, the photos had leaked. By Friday afternoon, the headlines had metastasized across every tabloid and news outlet with an internet connection. Billionaire's charity run by former waitress girlfriend. Love or leverage, inside the foundation's hidden power dynamic. Is she using him? He's using her? Inside their complicated romance. Lila saw them at the coffee shop. Someone had left a newspaper on the counter, open to an article that dissected her qualifications, her background, her relationship to Daniel, as if all three were disqualifying factors. She felt the familiar humiliation crawl up her spine, the sense of being seen and judged and found wanting, all because she'd been photographed near someone with money. Daniel found her in the foundation's small kitchen, staring at her phone without seeing it. "I've seen them," he said quietly. "Of course you have. The whole city has." She looked up at him with eyes that were bright with something between anger and despair. "They'll never let me be anything but your charity case. Everything I do here will be filtered through the lens of, she's only here because she's sleeping with him. I'm not qualified. I'm not credible. I'm just the girl who caught a billionaire." "Then let them talk," Daniel said. "We know the truth." "Do we?" The question came out sharp. "Because I still don't know if I'm here for the work or for you. And neither do you, really." You say you want this foundation to succeed, but did you want it before I existed? Or did you want it because I needed to believe you'd changed? His face fell. The words landed exactly where she'd aimed them, at the deepest uncertainty that had been haunting both of them since they'd reunited. I thought they were the same, he said finally. The work and you. I thought I couldn't separate them. That's the problem, she whispered. You shouldn't be choosing between me and your integrity. You should have integrity that includes me, not instead of me. He reached for her, but she stepped back. Not far. Just far enough to create space. I need air, she said. I need to think. She didn't wait for his response. She left him in the kitchen with the sound of the afternoon traffic and the weight of what she'd said. By Monday, the board had made their move, an emergency meeting, an ultimatum delivered to Daniel in a polished conference room by men in expensive suits who'd known him since childhood. This foundation experiment is draining resources, they said. Investors are losing confidence. The association with a woman who has no formal credentials is undermining your credibility as a leader. She has intuition, Daniel said quietly. She has compassion. She has you besotted. One board member interrupted. Step back from the girl or lose your seat at the table. Your choice, but choose quickly. The market doesn't wait for sentimentality. Daniel stood. He was quiet for a long moment, and in that moment, he made a decision that would have been unthinkable to him 6 months ago. Then you can have my seat, he said. All of it. I'm done. The silence that followed was absolute. No one had expected him to choose her. No one had believed he would actually walk away from the power structure that had defined his entire adult life. Later, when he told Marcia, she simply looked at him and asked, You're really in love with her, aren't you? For once, Daniel said, and there was no shame in his voice. I'm not ashamed to say yes. But the news got to Lila first. Not from Daniel, from a journalist who'd called the foundation asking for comment on Daniel's controversial resignation from his company's board. She learned about the ultimatum from the news before he had a chance to tell her himself. She stormed into his office late that afternoon, fury and confusion warring on her face. You were willing to throw your life away? For me? For us, Daniel said, standing to meet her. For what's right. I'm done being complicit in systems that hurt people. I don't want to be your reason to self-destruct. Her voice echoed through the empty foundation hall, bouncing off concrete walls. You keep trying to save me, keep making these grand gestures, but maybe I was meant to save you, from yourself. From this cycle where you self-destruct and then rebuild bigger and then self-destruct again. Lila. No, she said, holding up her hand. I'm tired of being the reason. I'm tired of being your redemption arc. I'm tired of wondering if you're here because you love me or because you need to prove something to yourself about being a good person. He flinched as if struck. Because she'd articulated something he hadn't let himself fully examine, the possibility that his need to prove himself might be another form of the control he'd been trying to shed. You need to let me go, Lila said quietly. Not because I don't care about you, but because I need to know who I am when I'm not standing in your shadow or your light. And you need to figure out how to want things without needing to save someone in the process. That's your real work. That's what you actually need to learn. How long? He asked. His voice sounded very small. I don't know, she said. But I need to know who I am. I need to stand alone. I need to build something in the foundation that's mine, not ours. And I need you to be okay with that. And if I'm not? She looked at him with infinite sadness. Then we're not actually fixed. We're just repeating the same pattern in different clothes. She walked out of his office without waiting for a response. He watched her go from his desk, watched her disappear into the evening beyond the glass doors, and realized that she was right. He'd done it again. He'd made a grand gesture instead of doing the quiet work of change. He'd chosen her publicly, when what she actually needed was for him to choose himself privately, to become someone worthy of her love, not because he was performing worthiness, but because he'd actually learned how to just be. Outside on the street, Lila walked into the evening with no destination. The city was warm and vast, full of people who had no idea who she was. That felt important somehow. That felt like the beginning of something. Behind her, in the lit office, Daniel sat in the quiet and whispered something he'd been learning to say. I need to learn how to let someone love me without control. I need to learn how to just exist, without needing to prove, or save, or fix. The words hung in the empty office like a prayer. Both of them were alone now. Both of them were standing exactly where they needed to stand. Apart, but not broken. Separated, but not estranged. Learning the hardest lesson love had to teach. That sometimes the most generous thing you can do for someone is let them find themselves, even if it means losing them in the process. The real test had only just begun. 6 months had passed. 6 months of silence between them. The kind of silence that felt less like absence and more like gestation. The necessary space where broken things either healed or hardened into permanence. The cafe was called The Second Chance, and it occupied a corner storefront in a neighborhood that had forgotten what hope looked like. The exterior was painted a soft sage green, with large windows that let light pour through like an invitation. Inside, mismatched tables and chairs created an intentional chaos. Nothing matched, but everything felt welcoming. Lila moved through the space with a confidence that hadn't existed in her before. She knew every regular's name. She remembered their orders, their stories, the small details that made them feel seen. An older man sat at a corner table, nursing soup she'd made that morning. A young mother with 2 children occupied the table by the window. A teenager, fresh from the shelter, scrolled through a laptop that the cafe provided. Free internet, free space, free warmth. On Saturdays and Sundays, the cafe served free meals. No questions asked. Just food and kindness and the implicit message that everyone deserved both. A woman approached the counter, wallet in hand. How much do I owe you? Lila smiled, the kind of smile that came from knowing something true about the world. It's on the house. We serve free meals on weekends. But I can pay. I know you can, Lila said gently. But once, someone showed me kindness when I least deserved it. Showed me that grace doesn't come with a price tag. I'm just returning the favor. The woman's eyes glistened. She nodded, understanding that she was part of a larger story. Not Lila's story, but a story that included her, that mattered because she mattered. This was Lila now. Not the girl who helped a billionaire. Just Lila. Known for kindness, known for seeing people, known for making the broken feel whole again. Across the city, in a newly renovated housing complex in a neighborhood that had been written off as unsalvageable, Daniel stood in a community garden and watched children run between raised beds of vegetables. He'd spent the morning helping a resident fix a fence. He'd spent the afternoon listening to a teenager talk about his dreams of becoming an architect. At the press conference that morning, a journalist had asked him the inevitable question, "You've liquidated billions of dollars of assets, left your company, stepped back from the corporate world entirely. Do you regret it?" Daniel had smiled, a real smile, not the polished corporate expression he'd perfected over decades. I gained something worth more than billions. I gained a life that means something. A life where I can look people in the eye and know I'm not extracting from them. I'm contributing to them. That's worth more than any portfolio. The journalist had seemed unsatisfied with the answer, kept pressing, but Daniel had simply stood and ended the conference. He'd learned that not every question deserved a long answer. Sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply walk away from the conversation that was trying to define you. Now, in the garden, a small boy approached him, holding a toy car with a wheel that had come loose. "Mr. D, can you fix it?" Daniel knelt down, examining the toy with the same focus he'd once reserved for mergers and acquisitions. The wheel was bent, but not beyond repair. He worked it gently back into place, testing the motion until the car rolled smoothly again. "There you go," he said, handing it back. The boy beamed and ran off into the late afternoon light. Daniel sat back on his heels and whispered to himself, "It's not about what you keep. It's about what you share. It's not about the size of the tower. It's about the warmth of the connection." He'd learned that in the silence, in the months alone, in the work of becoming someone he could actually respect. That evening, Daniel's car broke down on a street he didn't recognize. The engine simply stopped, mechanical failure meeting him at exactly the moment he needed to be stopped. He got out, loosening his collar, and looked around at the unfamiliar neighborhood. Small businesses, community centers, a cafe on the corner with soft green walls and light spilling out like gold. The sign read, "The Second Chance." His breath caught. He knew that name. He'd seen it in a news article months ago, about a young woman who'd opened a community cafe, who was quietly changing her neighborhood one meal at a time. He'd read the article 3 times without admitting to himself that he was looking for information about Lila. Through the window, he could see her. She was laughing with an elderly man she was serving soup to, her head thrown back in genuine joy, completely unself-conscious. She was radiant in a way that had nothing to do with wealth or status. She was radiant because she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. He hesitated outside, afraid to move, afraid to break the spell of being able to see her without being seen. She looked whole. She looked happy. She looked like someone who'd built a life that didn't need him to complete it. The bell above the door chimed as a child exited, letting the scent of coffee and soup and home spill out into the street. Lila turned at the sound, and her eyes found him immediately, as if some part of her had been waiting for this moment, as if she'd felt him standing outside the threshold between who they used to be and who they might become. They stared at each other across the cafe's warm interior. No one moved. No one spoke. The moment stretched like taffy, warm and elastic and full of possibility. She set down the soup bowl and walked to the door, opening it fully. "Hi," she said, simply. "Hi," he replied, and the word contained months of silence, years of longing, the complicated history of 2 people who'd hurt each other and survived it. An hour later, the cafe was empty. The last customer had left, and Lila had locked the door. She poured him coffee, black, no sugar, and they sat at a corner table, the kind of table where so many of their conversations had happened before. The warmth between them felt different now. Not the electric intensity of before, something deeper, something that had been tested and found to hold weight. "You found me again," Lila said softly. Daniel shook his head. "No, I think I finally caught up." She smiled at that. "I've been here, building something, not running from anything, just building." "I know," he said. "I read about this place. Months ago. I've been reading about it ever since." "And you came anyway?" "My car broke down," he said, and they both laughed because they knew better. They both knew this wasn't coincidence. This was timing finally catching up to intention. "You were right," Daniel said after a long moment. "Back then, when you walked out. You were right. I had to learn who I was without you. I had to figure out if I could want things without needing to save someone in the process. If I could build things without needing to control them. If I could just exist without performing." Lila reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I had to learn that I could forgive without forgetting, that I could love without losing myself, that asking for help doesn't make me weak, but refusing to stand on my own would. Then maybe, Daniel said, this time we start from honesty. Real honesty. The kind where we both know we could walk away if we needed to. And do we need to? Lila asked. He looked at her, really looked at her, and realized he'd never needed her less and wanted her more. That was the difference. That was the growth. No, he said. I don't think we do. Over the following weeks, Daniel began spending time at the cafe. He helped with repairs. He listened to customers' stories. He watched Lila move through the space and saw how she'd become the person he'd always believed she could be. Not because he'd helped her, but because she'd done the work. One afternoon, he brought papers to the cafe. Lila was wiping down the counter when he spread them out on a table. "What's this?" she asked, coming over. "A proposal," he said. "My foundation is proposing a partnership. Community cafes across the city, modeled after this one. Spaces that are warm and free and intentional about creating dignity. But I don't want to do it without you." She picked up the papers, scanning them. Her name was listed as co-director. Not assistant, not consultant. Co-director. "You'd trust me with that?" she asked quietly. "I'd trust you with the world," he said. "If you'd let me?" She teased. "That's a dangerous offer, billionaire." He laughed. "Ex-billionaire. I traded that for freedom. Turns out freedom is worth a lot more than I ever gave it credit for." As the evening deepened and customers filtered out, Daniel lingered. They sat in the cafe they'd come to think of as theirs, the one place where all the broken pieces had finally found their way back to each other. Before leaving, he paused by the door. Something he'd been thinking about for months suddenly felt important to say. "You asked me once why I hated umbrellas," he said quietly. "You said I always hoped someone kind would share theirs. I think I finally know the real reason. It's because I never wanted to walk alone in the rain." Lila stepped closer to him, her eyes searching his. "You don't have to anymore." She reached up and kissed him, not with the intensity of new love, not with the desperation of reunion, but with the certainty of two people who'd learned how to love each other without losing themselves in the process. It was simple. It was real. It was earned through months of silence and solitude, and the difficult work of becoming whole. When they pulled apart, she smiled against his mouth. "So what now?" "Now," he said, "we build something. Together. Something that lasts because it's built on honesty, not on saving each other. Something that survives because we both chose it, not because we need it. And if it gets hard again, then we do the hard thing," he said. "We tell the truth. We stay. We work. Because we know what the alternative is, and we know we're worth more than that." The cafe was quiet around them, full of the echo of hundreds of conversations, hundreds of moments of human connection. This was what they'd been meant to build together all along. Not a monument to themselves, but a space for others. A second chance. A place where broken things came to become whole again. And somehow, in the process of building it for others, they'd learned how to become whole together. The cafe was luminous. Not because of artificial light, though there was plenty of that, but because of the people who filled it. Their laughter, their voices, the way strangers were becoming community in real time. 6 months had passed since Lila and Daniel had reconciled, and tonight marked the official opening of the first Second Chance Cafe sponsored by the Foundation. The original location had inspired a network. What had begun as one woman's quiet act of kindness in a neighborhood corner had become a movement. The atmosphere buzzed with genuine energy, not the forced enthusiasm of corporate events, but the organic joy of people who felt welcomed. Live music drifted from a corner stage where a young musician played acoustic guitar. Volunteers, many of them people who'd once been homeless or struggling, served food with the care of people who understood exactly what it meant to be hungry and seen at the same time. Lila moved through the space like she'd been born to it, greeting guests by name, remembering their stories, introducing them to each other. She wore a simple dress, nothing designer, and her hair was loosely braided. She looked radiant not because she was the center of attention, but because she genuinely didn't need to be. She was content in the margins, in the connections, in the quiet work of making people feel safe. Daniel had rolled up his sleeves and was helping set up tables in the back. No speech prepared. No moment of recognition waiting. Just a man content in service, moving chairs, wiping down surfaces, checking that everything worked. When a child tugged his sleeve, a boy of maybe 7, energy barely contained, he knelt down immediately. "Mr. D, can we start the stories now?" the boy asked, practically vibrating with anticipation. Daniel grinned. "Go ahead, buddy, you're the star today." The child ran to the front of the cafe, where someone had arranged chairs in a circle. Other children gathered, a few adults. This was the new tradition, kindness circles, where people shared how acts of kindness had changed the trajectory of their lives. It had started organically, one guest sharing their story, then another, then another. Now it was woven into the fabric of every cafe opening. The first person to stand was a young man, maybe 23, with nervous hands and a hopeful face. "Last year," he said, his voice wavering slightly, "I was homeless. I was sleeping under the bridge on 5th. I had stopped believing that anything could change for me, but one day someone gave me a meal and said, 'Don't give up. You're worth more than this.'" He paused, emotions crossing his face. That person didn't have to say it. They didn't have to remember me the next day or the next week. But they did. Today, I work here. I have a place to live. I'm enrolled in community college. The room erupted in applause, genuine, moved, the sound of people witnessing transformation. Lila glanced at Daniel from across the room. Their eyes met, held, and in that glance was the entire arc of their journey. She whispered something, just to herself, or maybe to him, and he heard it somehow. "You started this." He shook his head slightly, mouthing back, "No, you did. I just followed your example." After the kindness circle concluded and the crowd began to thin, Lila and Daniel slipped out through the back door. The night was moving toward dusk, the sky painted in shades of orange and violet that made the world feel suspended between day and night, between what was and what could be. The city hummed around them. Traffic, distant sirens, the ambient sound of millions of lives happening simultaneously. But in the doorway of the cafe, it felt quiet. "Remember the first night?" Lila said softly. "You were drenched, freezing, and I almost didn't open the door." Daniel leaned against the frame beside her. "And you did anyway. Best mistake of my life." "You were terrible at washing dishes," she said, and there was laughter in her voice. "Still am," he admitted, "but I'm a little better at honesty." He reached into his coat and pulled out something worn and wrinkled, a receipt, stained with coffee and folded countless times. It was from the original cafe, from that first night. She recognized her own handwriting on the back. "You kept this," she said, amazed. "Kept it as a reminder of where it all began," he said. "Proof that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can rewrite an entire life. Rewrite 2 lives." She teased. "You sentimental fool." "Maybe," he said, and there was no defensiveness in it, just acceptance. "But I'm a fool who learned something true." Thunder rumbled in the distance, a warning and a promise. Lila looked up at the sky, and a smile spread across her face. "It always rains when we find our truth." "Then let it pour," Daniel said. The first drops came gently, then with more insistence. They stepped into the rain together, no hesitation, no umbrellas, no fear. The city streamed past them, people hurrying to shelter, but Lila and Daniel stood still under a streetlight, letting the rain soak through their clothes. "We're getting soaked," she said, laughing. "I know," he replied and pulled her closer. They danced slowly under the light, her head against his chest, his chin resting on her hair. The rain fell around them like benediction, like the world finally getting it right. People passed by, and some recognized them. The billionaire and the barista, the ones whose story had been splashed across tabloids and then quietly rebuilt in the margins of the city. But no one interrupted. The moment felt private and eternal, like something that belonged only to them. When they finally went back inside, they were drenched and glowing. Over the following months, the ripples continued to expand. More second-chance cafes opened across the city, in neighborhoods that had been abandoned, in communities that had been written off as unsalvageable. Each one followed the same model: free meals on weekends, warm space, dignity, and the quiet insistence that every person mattered. Daniel and Lila were visible in all of it, but never at the center. They mentored volunteers, many of them former homeless, formerly incarcerated, formerly hopeless. They served meals alongside everyone else. They listened to stories. They worked. On the wall of each cafe, a simple plaque read, "Inspired by one act of kindness." Lila's mother appeared in the background of their lives now, healthy and vibrant, helping to decorate for holidays, volunteering on weekends. She'd become a living symbol of what second chances meant, not just survival, but genuine recovery, genuine flourishing. One afternoon, Daniel helped a young man sign a job application. The young man's hands were shaking. "What are you nervous about?" Daniel asked. "I've never had a real job before," the young man said. "What if I mess it up? What if I'm not good enough?" Daniel thought about his own journey, about how he'd had to learn that being good enough wasn't about performance or credentials, but about showing up honestly, doing the work, and being willing to learn. "You're already good enough," he told the young man. "You're here. You're trying. That's the hardest part. And you've already done it." The young man got the job. One evening, 6 months into their rebuilt life together, Daniel stood at the cafe window and recorded a voiceover. It wasn't for publicity or press. It was just words he'd been sitting with, trying to articulate. "They said money builds empires," his voice echoed softly through the space. "But I learned kindness builds homes. Homes in hearts, not just in walls. And sometimes, all it takes is one open door to change a life forever. Not just one life, but every life that encounters that changed life. And then every life those lives encounter. Kindness doesn't stop with one person. It ripples. It expands. It transforms entire communities." The camera panned out from the cafe window. Inside, Lila and Daniel were pouring coffee for new guests. A family who looked tired, hungry, uncertain. The cafe wrapped around them with its warmth and its promise. "You're safe here. You matter here. There is room for you here." Rain tapped softly on the glass, the way it always did when something significant was happening. Lila looked up and met Daniel's eyes across the cafe. He was smiling at her, a smile that held everything, all the brokenness they'd survived, all the growth they'd accomplished separately and together, all the gratitude for being alive, for being given second chances, for learning that love wasn't about saving each other, but about building something that could save others. "Still no umbrella?" she asked, teasing. He looked out at the rain falling gently against the window and said, "Never. I found my shelter." The camera pulled back slowly, showing the bustling cafe, the community gathered within it, the rain falling outside like a benediction. The sign on the window came into focus: the Second Chance Cafe. And underneath, in smaller letters, a phrase that had become their philosophy: where kindness rewrites lives. The story didn't end there, of course. Stories of this kind never do. They continue in the lives changed by one cafe, then another, then another. In the young man who got his first job and eventually went back to school. In the woman who received a meal and learned she was worth saving. In the child who watched adults model kindness and learned it was possible to be both strong and generous. In the countless people who walked through those doors and discovered that they belonged somewhere. Daniel and Lila built something that outlasted their love story. Not that their love story ended. It didn't. It just transformed from being the focus of the narrative into being the foundation of something larger. They continued to choose each other every day through ordinary moments and extraordinary challenges. They continued to tell each other the truth, even when it was difficult. They continued to grow. But the real victory wasn't in their romance. It was in the fact that hundreds of people would never know their names, but would know their impact. Would know what it felt like to be offered a second chance, to be seen as whole when the world had written them off as broken, to be invited into a space where dignity wasn't conditional and kindness wasn't scarce. That was the ending, not the kiss, though there had been many. Not the wedding, though that came later, small and quiet in the first cafe, surrounded by the people whose lives they'd changed. But the ongoing, ordinary, extraordinary work of showing up and opening doors. In the final moment, the camera pulled back one more time, showing the city at night. Dozens of small lights marking the locations of second chance cafes, each one a point of warmth in the urban landscape. And in each one, people were being fed and seen and told that they mattered, that their lives could change. That kindness wasn't a luxury for the wealthy. It was the most basic human right, and it was available to everyone. The rain fell gently on all of it, on the cafes and the people inside them, on Daniel and Lila, somewhere in the city, probably still working, still learning, still building. And somewhere, in a neighborhood they hadn't reached yet, someone was about to discover that an open door existed. That safety was possible, that they hadn't been forgotten by the world, that someone cared enough to open a door and let them in. That was the real story. Not the love story, though that was beautiful. But the story of what love, when it's genuine, creates in the world. The story of how one act of kindness, repeated and expanded, can transform an entire city. The story of how two broken people learn to be whole, not for each other, but with each other, in service to something larger than themselves. The story of the Second Chance Cafe. And all the second chances that grew from one open door on a cold night, when someone chose kindness over fear.